The wind didn't just howl, it screamed like tearing metal. Alice pressed her bleeding fingers against the heavy cedar door, feeling the earth shudder as a massive avalanche buried her only exit. She had built this hidden underground bedroom to escape the world. Now it might be her tomb. Alice Foster didn't move to the unforgiving wilderness of the Montana Bitterroot Mountains for the scenery. She moved there to disappear. At 32, the former Chicago architect was a ghost of her former self, having spent the last 3 years navigating the grueling aftermath of a highly publicized, deeply traumatizing stalking case. The justice system had eventually locked the man away, but it couldn't restore Alice's shattered sense of security. City apartments felt like glass boxes. Suburban houses felt like display cases. She needed impenetrable walls. She needed the earth itself. In late April, Alice purchased 40 acres of heavily forested, deeply secluded land 20 miles outside the small logging town of Pine Ridge. The property was cheap because it was considered largely uninhabitable. The only structure was a rotting, single-room homesteader's cabin from the 1920s that looked as though a stiff breeze would flatten it. When Alice first visited the local hardware store, the owner, David Harding, a burly man with a weathered face and a skeptical eye, tried to talk her out of staying. "That land up on Blackwood Ridge is a death trap in the winter, Miss Foster," David had warned, leaning heavily on the wooden counter. "The county doesn't plow those service roads. If you get snowed in up there in that paper-thin shack, nobody is coming to get you until the spring thaw. Even Sheriff Mitchell won't risk his deputies on that ridge." "I like the quiet," Alice had replied politely, paying for her heavy-duty flashlights and contractor bags in cash. What David and the rest of the town didn't know was that Alice had no intention of actually living in the rickety surface cabin. It was merely a decoy, a prop for the mail carrier or any wandering hunter who happened to trespass on her land. Her real home was going to be 50 yards behind the cabin, concealed behind a dense, impenetrable thicket of dead lodgepole pines. During her initial survey of the property, Alice had stumbled upon a geological anomaly. Hidden behind a veil of thorny wild raspberry bushes and a collapsed boulder was a narrow fissure in the hillside. Armed with a flashlight and her lingering paranoia, she had squeezed through the 3-foot gap. She expected a shallow animal den. Instead, a rush of cool, ancient air greeted her. The fissure opened up into a dry, naturally insulated limestone cavern. It was roughly 20 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with a ceiling tall enough for her to stand comfortably. The floor was surprisingly level, composed of hard-packed earth and smooth river rock. For Alice, it wasn't a cave. It was a vault. It was a fortress where no one could look through a window, where no one could kick down a flimsy front door. Throughout the spring and summer, Alice worked with a manic, obsessive energy. She lived in the surface cabin, enduring the drafts and the mice, while secretly pouring all her resources into the cavern. She was terrified of building inspectors or curious locals discovering her project and condemning the property, so she worked exclusively at night or under the cover of heavy rain. She began by hauling down heavy sheets of rigid foam insulation, dragging them one by one through the thicket. She framed the interior of the cavern with pressure-treated lumber, essentially building a room within a room. She laid down a thick moisture barrier on the floor, topped with interlocking insulated subfloor panels and plush, dark carpets. The logistics were staggering for a single woman. She bought an expensive, high-capacity portable solar generator, placing the discrete solar panels on the roof of the decoy cabin and burying the heavy-duty armored cables in a trench that ran all the way to the cave. This gave her LED lighting, enough power for a laptop, and the ability to run a heated blanket. But her crowning achievement was the heating and ventilation. Deep in the back of the cavern, she found a natural, vertical chimney in the limestone that snaked upward, eventually opening out into a pile of boulders on the hillside above. She painstakingly fed a flexible, double-walled stainless steel exhaust pipe up through the natural rock vent, sealing it tightly with fire-grade mortar. She then connected it to a small, cast-iron wood-burning stove she had smuggled down piece by piece. By late September, the transformation was breathtaking. The harsh, rocky walls were hidden behind smooth, cedar-planked drywall. A plush, queen-sized mattress rested on a heavy wooden frame. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a small, dry pantry was stocked with hundreds of cans of soup, beans, and dried goods. The entrance to the cave had been fortified with a custom-built, steel-reinforced cedar door equipped with 3 heavy deadbolts. On the outside, she had meticulously camouflaged the door with bark, moss, and dead branches. Even standing 2 feet away, it looked like a solid rock face obscured by woodland debris. When she locked that heavy door behind her, the silence was absolute. The ambient temperature of the earth kept the room naturally at about 50 degrees, and with a small fire in the stove, it became a cozy, impenetrable sanctuary. Alice finally slept soundly for the first time in 3 years. She would spend her days up in the decoy cabin to maintain appearances, reading and drinking coffee by the window. But every night she retreated to the womb of the earth. She thought she had outsmarted the world. She had planned for human intruders. She had planned for the cold. But as the leaves on the aspen trees turned a violent shade of gold and then fell away to reveal the skeletal branches of November, Alice realized she had severely underestimated the raw, indifferent malice of a Montana winter. It began the week after Thanksgiving. The local meteorologists in Missoula weren't just predicting a storm. They were using phrases like historic atmospheric river, bomb cyclone, and the Great White Death. A collision of Arctic air from Canada and a freak moisture system from the Pacific was stalling directly over the Bitterroot Mountains. Evelyn, Alice's older sister, called frantically from Seattle. The connection was fuzzy, plagued by static from the shifting atmospheric pressure. "Abby, you need to leave." "Now!" Evelyn pleaded, her voice tight with panic. "I'm looking at the National Weather Service maps. They are predicting 4 to 6 feet of snow in 48 hours, with wind gusts up to 90 miles per hour. That cabin of yours won't survive. Pack your truck and drive down to Oak Haven while the roads are still somewhat clear." Alice stared out the single, drafty window of the decoy cabin. The sky wasn't grey. It was a sickening, bruised plum colour, hanging unnaturally low. The air felt heavy, pressing against her eardrums. "I'll be fine, Evie. I have plenty of firewood and enough food to last until April. I'm not leaving." "Alice, you are not invincible because you bought a gun and moved to the woods," Evelyn snapped, misinterpreting her sister's confidence. Evelyn didn't know about the cave. Nobody did. "If the roof caves in, you will freeze to death in minutes. I promise you, I am perfectly safe," Alice said, her hand resting on the pocket where she kept the heavy iron key to the vault. "I have a backup plan. I love you, Evie. I'll call you when the cell towers are back up." She hung up, plunging the decoy cabin into silence. The storm didn't arrive gradually. It hit with the concussive force of an explosion. At 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, Alice was in the surface cabin, boiling a pot of water on the propane camp stove, planning to make a thermos of tea before heading down to the cave for the duration of the blizzard. Suddenly, the wind struck the side of the fragile structure. The entire cabin groaned, shifting visibly on its foundation stones. A framed picture of their parents clattered off the wall, shattering on the floorboards. The temperature inside plummeted so rapidly that Alice could see her own breath pluming in the air. She looked out the window. The world had vanished. There were no trees, no mountains, no sky, only a violent, swirling vortex of blinding white. The snow was falling so fast and blowing so hard, it looked like solid sheets of ice moving sideways. Time to go, she thought, her heart hammering a sudden, frantic rhythm against her ribs. She grabbed her heavy parka, her insulated gloves, and her emergency go-bag. She secured the straps, took a deep breath, and kicked the front door open. The wind physically threw her backward. It was a solid wall of kinetic energy, roaring with a deafening, jet engine intensity. Ice crystals, sharp as ground glass, scoured her exposed cheeks. The temperature had instantly dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill that felt like liquid nitrogen. Alice forced herself out onto the porch, fighting to pull the cabin door shut behind her. The 50-yard walk to the cave, a journey she had made hundreds of times, suddenly felt like crossing a hostile alien planet. The snow was already knee-deep, shifting in massive drifts. She put her head down and pushed forward, using the tree line as a vague guide. 10 yards. 20 yards. The wind howled, tearing at her clothes, instantly freezing the moisture in her eyes, so that her eyelashes clumped together with ice. She couldn't see her own boots. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at her throat. If she missed the entrance, if she walked past the thicket, she would wander into the endless forest and freeze to death within 30 minutes. Keep the giant dead pine to your left, then turn right at the boulder. She repeated her mental map, fighting the disorientation of the whiteout. Her foot struck something hard, the collapsed boulder. Relief flooded her chest. She scrambled over the snow-covered rock, her hands numb inside her thick gloves, desperately tearing at the camouflaged branches she had so carefully placed over the cave entrance. Her fingers found the steel latch. She turned the heavy key, grabbed the handle, and pulled. The door, heavy as a bank vault, swung outward. Alice practically threw herself into the dark, narrow rock vestibule, dragging her bag behind her. The immediate absence of the screaming wind was shocking. It was suddenly quiet, save for her own ragged, gasping breaths. She pushed with all her remaining strength to close the heavy cedar door against the howling gale outside. The 3 deadbolts slammed into place with a satisfying, metallic clack, clack, clack. She leaned against the door, sliding down to the floor, laughing breathlessly in the pitch-black dark. She had made it. She was safe. She fumbled in her pocket for her small flashlight, clicking it on to illuminate the smooth cedar walls of her hidden sanctuary. The room was cold, but the air was still. Alice stood up, dusting the snow off her parka, preparing to light a fire in the cast-iron stove and wait out the storm in total comfort. But as she took a step toward the center of the room, a sound stopped her dead in her tracks. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of the wind. It was a low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock around her. The floor beneath her boots trembled. The glass in the frame of her lantern rattled violently. The mountain above her was moving. The horrific realization hit her a split second before the sound arrived. The freak winds, gusting at nearly 100 miles per hour, had snapped the massive dead lodgepole pines on the ridge directly above her cave. The falling timber had disturbed thousands of tons of unstable, heavily saturated snow, triggering a localized avalanche right on top of her position. A deafening, catastrophic roar consumed the cavern. The sheer force of the impact against the hillside transferred through the earth. Dust and loose dirt rained down from the rock ceiling above her drywall. Alice spun around and threw her weight against the heavy cedar door she had just locked. She threw the deadbolts back and shoved the handle. The door didn't budge. It didn't even rattle. She braced her boots against the rock wall and pushed with her back, screaming as she strained every muscle in her body. Nothing. Trembling uncontrollably, Alice pressed her ear against the thick wood. There was no longer the sound of wind. There was only a terrifying, muffled, heavy silence. The avalanche hadn't just covered the entrance. It had packed thousands of pounds of dense, concrete-hard snow, ice, and fallen timber against the other side of her door. Her sanctuary had held against the storm, but in doing so, it had sealed her inside. She backed away from the door, her flashlight beam shaking wildly as her hand trembled. Okay, it's fine," she whispered aloud, trying to stave off the crushing wave of claustrophobia. "I have food. I have water. I have the vent." She rushed over to the cast-iron stove. The small pile of kindling was already laid out. She struck a match and lit the paper, desperately needing the light, the heat, and the psychological comfort of the fire. The paper flared up, catching the small dry twigs. Smoke began to curl upward toward the exhaust pipe that led to the surface. For 10 seconds, the fire danced brightly. Then, the smoke stopped rising. It billowed backward, pouring out of the front grate of the stove and rapidly filling the small enclosed cavern. Alice coughed violently, her eyes stinging. She grabbed a towel and desperately smothered the flames, plunging the room back into the dim beam of her flashlight. She stared in horror at the exhaust pipe. The avalanche hadn't just buried her front door. It had sheared off the rocks above, completely blocking her ventilation shaft under 10 feet of packed ice and stone. Alice was buried alive, and she had a finite amount of breathable oxygen. The reality of her situation settled over Alice with the suffocating weight of the mountain itself. She threw herself at the barricade. She grabbed a steel crowbar from her toolkit, wedging it between the doorframe and the heavy cedar planks, pulling until her muscles screamed and her vision spotted with black. The wood splintered, but the steel reinforcement held firm. She worked frantically, the metal bar slipping in her sweaty grip, tearing the skin from her knuckles. Alice pressed her bleeding fingers against the heavy cedar door, feeling the earth shudder as another layer of snow settled above. The wind outside was muffled, but occasionally a gust hit the ridge so hard it sounded like tearing metal echoing down through the rock. Her own meticulous engineering was going to kill her. She had designed the door to withstand a battering ram. A crowbar wielded by an exhausted woman wasn't going to make a dent. Worse, the hundreds of pounds of compacted snow and ice pressing against the exterior meant that even if she broke the hinges, the door had nowhere to swing. Alice dropped the crowbar, the metallic clattered, deafening in the small space. She forced herself to sit on the edge of the mattress and breathe slowly. Panic was the enemy. Panic increased her heart rate, and an elevated heart rate consumed more oxygen. She did the grim math in her head. The cave was roughly 15 by 20 feet, with a 7-foot ceiling. 2,100 cubic feet of air. It sounded like a lot, but a human resting in an enclosed space didn't just consume oxygen. They expelled carbon dioxide. CO2 poisoning would claim her long before the oxygen dropped to fatal levels. Without ventilation, she calculated she had perhaps 48 hours before the air became too toxic to sustain consciousness. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in psychological torture. Without the wood-burning stove, the ambient temperature in the cavern began to plummet. The earth, which usually sat at a comfortable 50 degrees, was rapidly cooling as the sub-zero blizzard raged above, freezing the bedrock down to its core. Alice wrapped herself in every layer of clothing she owned, burrowing under her heavy winter sleeping bag. She plugged her electric-heated blanket into the portable solar generator. It offered a localized cocoon of warmth, but the digital display on the battery pack was a ticking clock. Without the solar panels on the decoy cabin, which were surely buried or destroyed by now, there was no way to recharge it. When the battery died, she would be at the mercy of the freezing dark. By the evening of the second day, the physical symptoms began. It started as a dull throb at the base of her skull, a persistent headache that refused to abate. Then came the yawning. Her body was desperately trying to purge the accumulating carbon dioxide from her lungs, forcing her to take deep, ragged breaths that yielded no relief. The air inside the cave felt incredibly heavy, almost gelatinous. Her mind, starved of clean air, began to slip its moorings. The shadows cast by her dimming LED lantern seemed to writhe and stretch. In the profound silence, her paranoia returned with a vengeance. She had built this bunker to hide from a monster who had stalked her through the streets of Chicago, a man who had made her feel cornered and helpless. Now, hallucinating in the thinning air, she kept hearing footsteps on the rock floor. She heard the scrape of a key in the lock. "You did this to yourself, Abby," she whispered, her voice sounding incredibly loud in the confined space. "You built your own coffin." She forced herself out of the sleeping bag, swaying dizzily as a wave of nausea washed over her. She couldn't just lie here and fade away. If she couldn't go through the door, she had to go up. She turned her attention to the back of the cave, where the natural limestone chimney housed her blocked exhaust pipe. The heavy cast-iron stove sat beneath it, useless and cold. Alice grabbed her wrench and began to blindly attack the thick bolts connecting the flexible stainless steel pipe to the stove. Her fingers were clumsy with the cold, her brain sluggish from the CO2. Every turn of the wrench required a monumental effort of will. Finally, the pipe detached. Alice wrestled the heavy iron stove out of the way, exposing the raw vertical shaft of the natural rock chimney. Shining her fading flashlight upward, she saw the blockage. About 6 feet up, the rock vent was choked with shattered slate, packed dirt, and a solid plug of bluish ice driven down by the avalanche. It looked impenetrable. But as she stared at the blockage, a desperate, wild idea began to form. She didn't need to dig a tunnel wide enough for her body. She just needed a tunnel wide enough for the air. Alice grabbed the detached 10-foot section of stainless steel exhaust pipe. It was rigid enough to hold its shape, but had enough flex to navigate the slight bend in the rock chimney. She hefted it upward, aiming the sharp metal rim directly at the plug of ice and debris above. With a guttural scream, she rammed the pipe upward. Crunch! The metal bit into the ice. Dirt and freezing water rained down on her face, blinding her. But she didn't stop. She pulled the pipe back and rammed it upward again. And again. She was using the heavy metal exhaust vent like a giant apple corer, trying to punch a breathing hole through the avalanche debris. Her shoulders burned with lactic acid. Blood from her torn knuckles made the metal slippery. The air in the cave was so foul now that she was taking breaks every 3 strikes just to dry heave into the darkness. Ram, twist, pull, ram, twist, pull. She lost all track of time. It could have been hours. It could have been days. The battery on her generator finally beeped a continuous, high-pitched warning and died, plunging the cave into absolute pitch blackness. Her headlamp was her only remaining source of light, its beam growing weaker by the minute. Just as her arms were about to give out completely, she shoved the pipe upward with the last reserve of her strength. The resistance vanished. The pipe slid upward another 3 feet with a hollow scraping sound. Alice froze, panting, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled the pipe back slightly, and then she felt it. A draft. It was faint, carrying the freezing, sharp scent of pine needles and ozone, but it was moving downward through the metal tube. Clean air. She dropped to her knees, positioning her face directly under the open end of the pipe hanging from the ceiling, and inhaled deeply. The frigid air hit her lungs like a jolt of electricity, clearing the terrifying fog from her brain. She had a snorkel. She wouldn't suffocate. But the relief was short-lived. The air rushing in was 15 degrees below zero. Without the battery to power her blanket, she would succumb to hypothermia within hours. Meanwhile, 60 feet above her, the blizzard had finally broken. The sky over the Bitterroot Mountains was a brilliant, painful blue, revealing a landscape utterly transformed. Sheriff Mitchell and David Harding waded through snow that was waist-deep, even with snowshoes. They were leading a small search and rescue team toward Alice's property. Evelyn had called the sheriff's department in a panic when her sister's phone went straight to voicemail for 3 days. When they crested the ridge, Sheriff Mitchell stopped dead in his tracks. "Lord Almighty," he muttered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The decoy cabin was gone. A massive, ancient lodgepole pine, easily 4 feet in diameter, had snapped in the gale and fallen directly across the structure, flattening it into a pile of shattered lumber and twisted metal. It was buried under 4 feet of fresh powder. "She's gone, Sheriff," David said softly, leaning on his poles. "Nobody survives a hit like that. Even if she was in the basement, the weight of that tree—" "Start probing," Mitchell ordered grimly, gesturing to his deputies. "We have to recover the body for her sister." As the deputies began driving long fiberglass avalanche probes into the ruins of the cabin, David wandered away from the wreckage. He was a practical man, a builder by trade, and something was bothering him. He remembered the supplies Alice had purchased all summer. "You don't buy 200 feet of armored subterranean electrical cable to power a single-room shack," David muttered to himself. He looked past the crushed cabin toward the dense thicket of dead pines, noticing a strange depression in the snowbank. The avalanche had swept down the hill, but the snow pattern looked disturbed, almost as if it had flowed over a concealed structure. David walked toward the thicket, his snowshoes crunching loudly. He stopped near a pile of snow-covered boulders. He looked down and frowned. Sticking up out of the snow, looking completely out of place in the pristine white wilderness, was the jagged, silver rim of a stainless steel pipe. He knelt down, brushing the snow away from the opening. He could feel faint, rhythmic puffs of slightly warmer air coming from the tube. "Sheriff!" David bellowed, his voice echoing off the ridge. "Bring the shovels over here, now!" David leaned directly over the pipe, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Hello? Miss Foster, are you down there?" Deep in the dark, freezing cavern, Alice was curled in a fetal position, shivering violently, her lips turning a dangerous shade of blue. Through the haze of hypothermia, she heard a sound echoing down the metal tube. It sounded like a voice. She dragged herself off the floor, her joints screaming in protest. She grabbed her heavy metal wrench. Reaching up, she struck the side of the hanging exhaust pipe as hard as she could. Clang! 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 Above ground, the sound rang out of the pipe like a church bell. "We've got her!" Mitchell shouted, dropping his probe and grabbing a specialized aluminum snow shovel. "Dig! Everyone, dig!" It took them 3 hours to move the tons of compacted snow and clear the massive tree branches that had wedged against the concealed cedar door. When they finally broke through the camouflage, Sheriff Mitchell stared in sheer disbelief at the industrial steel deadbolts on the subterranean bunker. They had to use a gas-powered saw to cut through the heavy timber and steel. As the heavy door finally fell inward, a cloud of stale, freezing air rushed out. David was the first one inside, his flashlight beam piercing the gloom. He found Alice huddled in the corner, clutching the wrench, her face pale, but her eyes fierce and alive. "You were right, Mr. Harding," Alice whispered, her voice a raspy croak as she squinted against the blinding glare of the rescue lights. "The county definitely doesn't plow up here." Alice survived the Great White Death, losing only the tips of 2 fingers to frostbite. The stalker who forced her into hiding never found her, but the mountain nearly claimed her instead. She eventually sold the property to the county, moving to a small, above-ground home in Pine Ridge. She traded her impenetrable vault for a community that proved far stronger and much safer than stone walls and heavy deadbolts.